ever had loose stitches, loops, or weird eyelashes on the front or back of your fabric? I certainly have. But don't panic. I'll show you how to fix most thread tension problems at home, no screwdriver required, and no expensive repairs. Hi, I'm Beth Ann. Let's talk about what a good or balanced machine stitch is supposed to look like, how to tell what's going wrong, quick fixes to try, when and how to adjust the upper thread tension on your sewing machine, and when to take it to a professional. Fortunately, before you ever need to call a technician, there's a lot you can do by yourself, and I'll walk you through it step by step. The first step in troubleshooting is to unthread and rethread your sewing machine, and make sure that the thread is seated properly in the tension discs in your machine. If you've ever had tension problems mysteriously fix themselves after rethreading, this is probably why. You might be surprised how often this does the trick. It's usually pretty easy to see if your presser foot is up during normal sewing or quilting, but sometimes we may forget that the foot must be raised, as well as having the needle raised to its highest position when we thread or unthread the sewing machine. This will open up the tension discs and allow the thread to be seated properly, or to be removed cleanly. However, it can be a little bit tricky to determine with just a glance when using a free motion foot, especially if you're using one that floats above the fabric. You may need to manually raise the presser foot to be sure that it's in the raised position. And unfortunately, most people tend to grab the spool and pull the thread out at the top of the machine, but that has the potential to make any problems worse. When you unthread your machine, it's helpful to train yourself to always cut the thread up by the spool and pull it out down by the needle. You'll be less likely to pull any schmutz or thread fuzz up into the tension discs that way. Instead, it can help bring any fuzz out of the machine along with the end of the thread. Something else that can happen is that the spool may spin a little too fast and too much thread comes off the spool and then it gets caught on or wrapped around the spool pin. Typically, we don't notice that that has happened until the thread tension goes wonky or the thread eventually breaks. Avoiding abrupt starts and stops and using a felt pad next to the spool, here I have a white felt pad, as well as using a spool cap can help prevent the spool from spinning. A spinning spool releasing too much thread while a stitch is being formed can also contribute to thread nests or weird loops at the beginning or middle of your stitching. Sometimes using a thread net to keep the thread from coiling off the spool is a quick and easy solution. Here I'm using a thread net folded back on itself to help control monofilament thread. This will prevent the thread from coiling off the spool and getting wrapped around the spool pin. If any of these tips saved you a trip to the repair shop, please hit that like button so other quilters can find this video too. And now that you know some of the quick fixes, let's dig a little deeper, because when you understand the why, you'll be able to solve most issues faster and more confidently in the future. Let's start with what a good stitch is supposed to look like. To help make it easier to see, I'll be using dark blue for my top thread, which will go through my needle, and white for my bobbin. If you've ever read about thread tension, you've probably seen a graphic like this. Here, the top thread is visible on the surface of the fabric, and the bobbin thread is visible on the back side of the fabric. The threads interlock in the middle of the fabric or the batting if it's a quilt. Here's a look at a perfectly balanced straight stitch from the front of the fabric. All we see is the blue top thread. And if we turn it over, all we see is the white bobbin thread. If you look very closely, you might be able to see the holes made by the needle, but none of the blue thread is poking up through those holes. The same factors apply if you're free motion quilting. Here's a view from the front of the fabric No bobbin thread in sight. And here's a view from the back of the fabric. No top thread in sight. Even though you can see the needle holes, none of that top thread is being pulled through. So what happens when things don't look right? Let's take a closer look at these two examples. It may be hard to see on your screen, but now the blue top thread is pulling up a pinprick of white bobbin thread to the surface of the fabric with every stitch. And here, the bobbin thread is winning the tug of war, and the blue top thread is being pulled to the back side of the fabric. We're not looking at the needle holes between the white stitches here. We're looking at tiny loops of blue top thread that is being pulled through to the back. Now, if you've ever unthreaded and rethreaded and your stitches are still not behaving, don't worry. Let's run through a few more quick at-home checks. Here's some questions you can ask yourself. Does my fabric have a looser weave than I normally use? Sometimes it isn't really a problem with thread tension. It just looks that way because a looser weave lets the thread on the opposite side pop through the fabric. Are my threads good quality and a good match for each other? Now, personally, when I'm using 50 weight all-purpose thread, I usually use the same thread in the top and in the bobbin. But for heavier decorative threads, I often find it helpful to use a finer thread in the bobbin. Also, some machines seem to have a preference for cotton versus poly in the bobbin, or vice versa, not so much for straight sewing, but for more advanced techniques. Is my needle the right size for my thread? A needle that's too large can leave holes that the thread can't fill properly, making it easier for the opposite thread to show through. And a needle that's too small increases friction and can damage the thread and cause breakage. Does my machine need to be cleaned out? This is a biggie, although I admit I sometimes try adjusting the tension settings before taking the time to give my machine a proper clean out. Stitches still not improving? Okay, you've cleaned, rethreaded, and checked the basics. What's next? This step intimidates a lot of quilters, but once you see how it works, you'll never be afraid of your tension dial again. It's pretty amazing what changing just this one setting can do. A quick note here, you'll notice I'm specifying adjusting the upper thread tension. I recommend leaving any bobbin tension adjustments to a qualified technician. Don't do those at home. It's usually pretty easy to find the thread tension setting on a fully computerized machine like mine. It's clearly labeled and has a plus and minus sign right next to it. Other machines might have a dial either on the front of the machine or one on or near the top of the machine, like this one. Either way, you want to start by moving the dial just one number or half a number at a time. You can continue adjusting as needed. Remember this graphic? The top thread and the bobbin thread are interlocking in the middle of the fabric or batting. But sometimes things go wrong. This graphic shows the bobbin thread being pulled to the top of the fabric. That means there's too much tension on the top thread. We need to lower the upper thread tension. For most machines, the upper thread tension should be turned down to a lower number. Here's that example. It may be hard to see here, but the blue top thread is pulling up a pinprick of white bobbin thread to the surface of the fabric with every stitch. And in this free motion sample, the top thread is almost just laying there, and there are noticeable loops of bobbin thread, especially on tight curves and points. The upper thread tension is too high. Sometimes this isn't really a thread tension issue, particularly if it's only happening at points or sharp changes in direction. It may be that the needle wasn't all the way down in the fabric before making the turn and the stitch wasn't completed properly. But in this case, we can tell that it's a tension issue because even on the more gentle curves, if you look closely, You can see tiny loops of white bobbin thread are being pulled to the surface of the fabric. The upper thread tension is too high. Now let's look at the opposite problem. The top thread is being pulled to the back of the fabric. There's too much tension on the bobbin thread, or too little on the top thread. So we need to increase the upper thread tension since we're leaving that bobbin tension alone. And so for most machines, the upper thread tension should be turned to a higher number. Here's our example. Again, it may be a little hard to see, but in this case, the blue top thread is being pulled to the back side of the fabric. We're not just looking at needle holes between the white stitches. We're actually seeing that blue top thread popping through. And here's the same problem showing up in free motion quilting. Now it's the bobbin thread sitting on top of the fabric and bringing visible loops of blue top thread to the back side of the fabric. Again, the upper thread tension is too low. So you would just make those adjustments. But what if changing the upper thread tension isn't helping? If you haven't already, I recommend you stop and clean out your machine. I try to clean my machine out and change the needle with every 2 to 3 bobbin changes, or at least the end of every project. It really makes a difference. Now, if you've done all of this and it's still not working, sometimes it's not you, it's something else going on with the machine. Signs it's time to seek help include persistent looping despite careful rethreading, skipped stitches even with a new needle, fabric not feeding through the machine properly, tension control adjustments not having any impact at all, or it just doesn't feel or sound right. You know your own machine. Listen to your own intuition. Sometimes it's not you or anything that you can do. It's the machine, and professional service can get it back to factory fresh. All right, friend, now you have a roadmap for troubleshooting thread tension at home. I know this was a lot of information, so I created a 2-page free printable guide that walks you through the steps that we covered today. You can grab it in the description box below. It's my gift to you. And if this video helped you, please subscribe so I can keep making tutorials like this. Happy quilting, and I'll see you in the next video.